Good morning, everyone. Parakimel Mishna Tes. Ha'evit karchamim v'hakusi. Ha'evit karchamim means an idol worshiper, which means a non-Jew. V'hakusi, an Akuthian. We'll explain what that is soon. Trumas and Truma. The Truma that they separate is Truma. Masraseh and Maser. And the 10th that they separate for the Levi, for the Meiser Sheni, is effective. It is a Meiser. Hekdesh and Hekdesh, and whatever they consecrate is consecrated. So the Mishnah here is telling us if a non-Jew were to separate Truma or Meiser, it would work. It would count. It would be effective. Effective means that in regarding Truma, that a non-Kohen would not be permitted to eat it. The separation of the Truma and the Meiser now take off the status of tevel from the grain so that anybody can eat the rest of it afterwards. Hekdesh and Hekdesh means if they consecrate an animal for a sacrifice or consecrate something towards the Beis HaMikdash, it works. Now, the fact that they can consecrate something to the Beis HaMikdash, there are verses for that, from where to derive it. That's that halacha. Now, the part about the goy separating Truma, now that is a very interesting concept. Clearly, a non-Jew does not have an obligation to separate Truma. It's not one of the 7 Noachai mitzvahs. So he doesn't have an obligation to separate Truma. But the Mishnah is telling us that if he does separate Truma, it works. And the power to separate Truma, some explain, is similar to the power to consecrate something. Just as we know that the non-Jew could consecrate an animal as a sacrifice, he can consecrate things for the Beis HaMikdash. So, which means he has the ability to affect a sanctity upon something. That tells us he could affect Truma also. Now, at the same time, first thing that we have to clarify or make sure that we remind ourselves is that, again, he doesn't have an obligation to separate Truma. And as we learned previously, a Jew would not be able to make a non-Jew as an agent to separate Truma because he's not obligated in the mitzvah. Even though our Mishnah is saying he could actually affect Truma, nonetheless, he's not obligated, and therefore he would not be able to be a shliach, an agent for a Jew to separate the Jew's Truma. Okay, now, in order to understand this halacha about the non-Jew affecting Truma, there are really 2 issues that the commentaries point out we have to deal with. Number 1, the mitzvah of Truma and Meiser only apply in the land of Israel. They don't apply outside of the land of Israel. So if we're talking about a non-Jew owning a piece of land in Israel, so do we say that the ownership of a non-Jew in the land of Israel takes off the halachic status to some degree of the land of it takes off a certain level of sanctity from the land, and therefore it actually takes off the obligation to separate for Truma and Meiser? That's one question. That's one issue. A non-Jew owns land in Israel. Actually, there is an opinion out there. There's an opinion that says that it actually takes off the mitzvah of Truma and Meiser from the land. So if he owns a piece of land and he grows crops, there's no obligation for Truma and Meiser, and a Jew could eat it without having to do anything. That's one issue that has to be dealt with, which clearly, if our Mishnah says that, or it would seem that if the Mishnah says that the guy could separate, and it just says he could do it, that would seem to imply that even if we're talking about he owns a piece of land in Israel, that number 1, in order to say that the guy can separate Truma, there has to be an obligation of Truma on this grain. If there's an obligation of Truma on this grain, he wouldn't be able to affect Truma. And therefore, it must be that our Mishnah is of the opinion that a non-Jew who takes ownership of land in Israel does not take off any of the sanctity, does not take off any of the obligations of the land. And therefore, that would mean that the same way that a Jew's grain grows in the ground in Israel, obligation for Truma and Meiser, if his grain outside of Israel doesn't have an obligation for Truma and Meiser, but his grain in Israel has an obligation for Meiser, So too, a non-Jew who owns a piece of land in Israel doesn't make a difference. So what? It's not a non-Jew owning a piece of land. It's the land of Israel. It's the land of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, what's produced from it has the obligation for Trum and Meiser. Now, for the guy, for the non-Jew, it makes no difference. He doesn't have a mitzvah. It would make a difference for a Jew. If a Jew would want to eat this grain, he could only eat this grain, Trum and Meiser, was separated. And the Mishna is saying that not only does this grain produced by the guy have an obligation of Trum and Meiser, but he could actually separate it himself. Now, there's another issue that has to be dealt with, and that is that as we learned previously, the obligation of Truma and Meiser to be separated from a grain only takes effect after the entire processing of the grain has been completed, the entire harvesting processing, which means it has to be harvested, it has to be threshed, it's piled up, and then the pile is smoothed over on top. That's the conclusion of the processing of the Truma, of the grain. And that is when the obligation for separating Truma and Meiser takes effect. So if we're talking about that, again, to keep it simple, the guy has a piece of land, and we're saying his piece of land, his grain, has an obligation of Truma and Meiser, at least towards a Jew. Now, what happened? The grain was processed. Who processed it? If we're going to say that the guy processed it, that means that the completion of the processing, which is the point in which the obligation for Truma and Meiser takes effect, came about through his completion of the processing. And that's also a question as to whether if a non-Jew processes the grain, meaning if the point of effect of the obligation takes place through the act of a guy, it could be that actually would exempt the Truma and Meiser from it. Because since the processing, which is the point of where the obligation takes effect, is done by someone who doesn't have the mitzvah, then it doesn't take effect. Apparently, our Mishnah would seem to be learning that that's not a problem either. That a guy who completes the processing, the Truma and the Meiser can still take effect. So if we read the Mishnah, according to many of the commentaries, the way to read the Mishnah is that it's talking about any case that dealing with a non-Jew, and the point would be that the grain has an obligation of Truma and Meiser on it. Of course, that doesn't make a difference to the guy, it makes a difference to the Jew. And even if the guy goes ahead and he completes the processing of the grain, the Truma, the obligation of Truma and Meiser takes effect. And the Mishnah is telling us that the guy could actually separate the Truma and the Meiser because it's no different than consecrating an animal to the Beis HaMikdash, or at least it's the same power. Others learn the Mishnah differently. And they learn that the Mishnah is not talking about every case. The Mishnah could be talking about a case where what happened is that the grain was processed. The grain was owned by a Jew. The grain was processed by a Jew, and the guy bought it before Truma and Meiser were taken. Different opinions at what point he separated the Truma and Meiser. But we could be talking about a case where the land belonged to the Jew. That could be the starting point. And therefore, the grain definitely gets obligation. It's grown from a land that has the obligation in Meiser. If it would be owned by a guy, it wouldn't have the obligation. It was owned by a Jew, therefore the obligation potentially is there. Who did the processing? According to some, it wasn't the guy who did the processing. It's the Jew who did the processing. But at the end of the day, it landed up by a guy. The guy bought it, and he went ahead and he separated. And now that we're talking about a full-fledged obligation was created, Jewish land, the Jew finished the processing. It's only a question of doing the actual separating. He bought the grain, it's his grain, and he went and he separated the Truma and the Meiser from it. And Mishna is saying it works. Some learn that the explanation is that the guy separated the Truma before the processing. So again, it was owned by a Jew, and the guy separated before the processing, which could be done. And that's what we're talking about. So again, we have different opinions how to read the Mishnah. According to some, the Mishnah is of the opinion that the guy's land processing, not a problem by the guy, and he can separate the Truma. And others say that no, regarding the actual growing and the processing, that perhaps was done by a Jew, or it wasn't done by a non-Jew, the processing. But at the end of the day, the grain has an obligation of Truma Meiser. It's growing from a Jewish land, and the actual separation at the end was done by the guy. Okay, that's the first opinion of our Mishnah. Then the Mishnah continues. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein la'evek kachavim kerem revai. A guy does not have the law of kerem revai. The chachamim oimrim yesh lai, and the sages say that he does have. Now, we first have to explain what is kerem revai. There's a law in the Torah called Arla, that the first 3 years of a tree, its fruits are forbidden to eat. It's called Arla. The 4th year, they're permitted to eat, but they have a sanctity. They have to be either taken to the base of Yerushalayim to be eaten, or they can be redeemed onto money, and the money is taken to Yerushalayim and spent on food. Now there is a question if this law of Revai only applies to a vineyard. Does it apply to all trees? Even though our Mishnah says Kerem Revai, it says the 4th year of the vineyard. This is an issue that comes up in many Mishnayos, and according to the opinion that it applies in all cases of Revai, and by all trees, you'd have to change the wording to Neta Revai, the 4th year of the sapling, of what grows from the tree, or the young tree. Rabbi Yehuda says a guy does not have Kerem Revai. Now, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is like this. Arla applies whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or outside of Eretz Yisrael. So even if, let's say, you say that even if you hold that a non-Jew owning a piece of land in Israel is like a piece of land outside of Eretz Yisrael, there's no obligation of Truma and Meiser. Nonetheless, Arla we know applies outside of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, the guy owning the land in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, since the point is it's like a piece of land outside of Eretz Yisrael, so there is no Truma and Meiser, but it's still Arla. It's still going to be Arla. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, Arla there is. But what follows Arla, which is Revai, the 4th year status of the fruit, does not apply by a guy. Because the Revai follows the same pattern as Truma and Meiser. For that, it has to be the land of Israel. That's where Revai applies. Revai applies in Israel, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that a piece of land owned in Israel by a guy is like a piece of land outside of Eretz Yisrael, then Revai is not going to apply, although Arla does. But the sages say it does have Revai, because the sages say that actually, just as Arla applies outside of Eretz Yisrael, Revai also applies outside of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, even if you're going to say that the land owned by a guy in Eretz Yisrael is like a piece of land in Chutz La'aretz outside of Eretz Yisrael, won't make a difference for Revai, because the same way Arla applies outside of Eretz Yisrael, Revai applies outside of Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah continues, Trumas ha'oivei kachavim. The truma of a non-Jew, as we mentioned before, the damas, it actually can create the demua mixture we spoke about previously, that if truma falls into non-truma grain, if you don't have 100 times more of the non-truma grain, the truma that got mixed in will now forbid the entire pile because we don't know where the truma is. And you have to sell, and what you do is you sell it to a kohen minus the truma that's in there, because that he's supposed to get for free. And if you have 100 times more, it becomes nullified. So now you can eat everything in the pile. You just have to make up to the kohen the truma that he missed out on and give him other grain towards that. But if it's 100 times more, the whole pile becomes permissible. So the truma of a guy, our Mishnah is saying, bidamas, it will create this suffix, this doubt as to whether I have truma here or not. He separated truma. It has the regular status of truma to say that it can that if it mixes into less than 100 times more of non-truma grain, it's going to make the whole thing forbidden. And not only that, we learned previously that if a non-Kohen eats truma, he has to pay back the principal, he has to return the principal, plus a fifth more, okay, which is called the fifth. It's really a quarter more, but it's the surcharge called the chomish, called the fifth. Now, according to this first opinion mentioned in the Mishnah, If it has the surcharge of a chomesh for eating it, then again, it's full-fledged truma. Full-fledged truma. Rabbi Shimon paiter. Rabbi Shimon exempts it from chomesh. Rabbi Shimon says, no, you don't have to pay that chomesh. If you eat this truma separated by a guy, then the chomesh you don't have to pay back. At the same time, the commentaries point out that Rabbi Shimon's word is poter. He exempts. Exempts is a word to say, I'm not obligated in something, which means I'm not obligated in the chomesh. But he doesn't say that it doesn't make the mixture, which means Rabbi Shimon does agree to the opinion, to the first opinion, that the truma of a guy, if it gets mixed in, it will create this forbidden mixture. But the truma of a guy, there's no penalty of a chomesh. So the explanation for Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Shimon is saying that the guy owns land in Eretz Yisrael, it does not have any status of truma. Actually, think of that. According to Rabbi Shimon, a guy cannot separate truma. That's how the commentaries explain. Based on a pasuk in the Torah, a guy cannot separate truma. Forget about his land that he owns. Is it like Eretz Yisrael? Can he do the completion process? A guy cannot separate truma. Finished. Can't do it. Just that, according to Rabbi Shimon, if a guy does it, then his truma is a truma midrabanan. The rabbis declare that his truma is a truma. If he does it outside of Eretz, from the Torah's point, it's nothing. But the Rabbanan said if he separates truma, again, based on the conditions mentioned before, his truma will work, but only midrabanan, only according to rabbinic law. So being that it is a truma midrabanan, if it gets mixed into non-truma grain, it's going to make a forbidden mixture unless it's 100 times more. But the Chachamim, the sages, when they said that the guy's truma is a truma, they didn't put the chomesh surcharge on it. As we said before, the chomesh penalty is not a part of the atonement that a non-Kohen needs for eating truma. And therefore, here, in this rabbinic case of the guy's truma, they didn't apply the surcharge because it's not an essential part of the atonement from the Torah's point. So according to Rabbi Shimon says a guy's truma is not a good truma. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, midrabanan it's a truma. It'll create the forbidden mixture, but it will not. It will not. There will be no charge of a chomesh when non-Kohen eats it. So the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon, that the guy's truma would have the chomesh. And again, the halacha is also not like Rabbi Yehuda, but like the Chachamim, that a guy's grain would have the mitzvah of a revai of the fourth year on it. Okay. 1 second. Okay, mitzvahs loisase, prohibition, shalor lishchet behema tahira, not to shecht, not to slaughter a kosher animal, he uvlada, it and its child, b'yom echad, on the same day. Shenamar, as the pasuk states, v'shor oiseh, a cow or a ewe, oiseh v'espenoi l'sishchatu b'yom echad, it and its child, you shall not slaughter on the same day. V'm'abar v'shachat, if a person did it, person transgressed the prohibition, habasa kosher. The meat is still kosher to eat. The day follows the night. Meaning, as we know in Jewish law, the beginning of the day starts from the night. Therefore, if a person slaughtered the mother at the beginning of the night of the fourth day, okay, meaning it was Wednesday, but when does Wednesday start? What we call Tuesday night. So that's the beginning of Wednesday night, beginning of the night of Wednesday, which is the beginning of Wednesday. Cannot slaughter the child until the beginning of day 5, which would be the following night of the 5th day. The mishachat, again, 5th day just meaning Thursday. But if let's say you shech the mother at the end of Wednesday, daytime, you could shech the animal that night, the night of Thursday. Because again, it's about not being within the same day. And since day is determined by nightfall, so if it comes out that you shechted the mother at the beginning of Wednesday, which was what we call Tuesday night, so then you have to wait until the next, you have to wait for Tuesday night and Wednesday to be able then to slaughter it Wednesday night, which is already the beginning of Thursday. But if let's say you went ahead and you shechted the mother at the end of Wednesday, well, that night turns into the next day. Once it's the next day, you can go ahead and slaughter the child. This applies in all places at all times, both by men and by women. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos.